On to Ambassador Jones, there's a lot of news about Turkey with the sanctions that were imposed, and you, of course, served as the principal consul general there in Istanbul, with as well a connection now, of course, to Libya when you were ambassador. When we talk about Libya, we talk about all these countries, UAE, Egypt, Turkey, the Europeans. All with a stake, it seems, in Libya. What is our stake in Libya, and what would President-elect Biden's approach be to this ongoing, interesting conflict?
Thank you, Aida. And first of all, let me add to my colleagues and say what a delight and a privilege it is to be on the same panel with these two colleagues who are so accomplished and probably far more articulate and coherent than I'm going to be, especially dealing with the subject of Libya. Coming right out of the box, I would say something which is that, as I think we all know, the Biden administration, I'd say a couple of things. First, the Biden administration is going to be really focused on big issues. I mean, COVID, the economy, the global economy, the rise of power, great power competition, and also the rise of medium power competition in the regions, the medium power overlap. I'll talk a little bit about that, but also about our transatlantic relationships, some of which many are calling into question, and I'll exemplify that in Libya, in the case of Libya as well. But also, the environment, international trade. So insofar as those things intersect in places, you're going to see focus, more focus, and Libya is a kind of a petri dish for a lot of these things. But I also want to underscore one other thing that I think we all need to bear in mind as we kind of project on administrations, and that is the perspective from overseas. For the three of us who between us have over 100 years of service with the U.S. government, we were accustomed to working in an environment where foreign policy was bipartisan policy, largely, with probably one or two exceptions in our careers where these were really bipartisan. Even the invasion of Iraq had Democrats in the Senate, voting for it. We're now at a period where and I say this with deep humility when I talk about Libya, because I think our smugness, we need to look again at our own governance situation here in the United States, the uncertainty about it, a lot of the question marks that have been raised about our ability to conduct a unified foreign policy. And if I were a leader in the region, in the Near East region, or anywhere in Turkey or elsewhere, I would be assessing in my mind whether this Biden administration is going to last for more than 4 years. I would be saying, well, gee, if the other side got 74% or 74 million votes and all of this churn about it right now, do I hold off or do I go forward with whatever the Biden administration is doing? And I think that that's something we all need to keep in our minds. And I think with the conclusion in my mind that the regional powers are going to do more and more of what they see in their self-interests, and that we need to calculate that, take that into consideration in our calculus, what it is that matters to them, and their willingness to kind of deflect or ignore what the U.S. had, not entirely ignore, but to customize our policies toward their ends. And I think Libya provides an extreme example of that. When we come to Libya, I think there are two issues here. One is the Libyan situation internally and what it would take to solve that situation. And I think what we all saw with the demise of Gaddafi was that we were dealing with a very both fragmented and networked situation in Libya with really different interests, whether you were in the oases area, the desert areas, the tribal areas, or the city-state areas, both in the east and the west. But I think that most people would agree in broad terms that the issues that have divided the Libyans themselves, and I'm not talking here right now about external powers, I'm talking about the Libyans themselves, have been issues of governance arrangements. Now, they hate the word federalism. Many Libyans do. We've tried to use different terms in that, whatever you want to call it. And I think that one of the terms that people have focused on is subnational governance as a broad term to say, how do you which we're dealing with in the States, by the way, as well here. But subnational governance arrangements, how to distribute the political power amongst Libyans, and also how do you distribute the nation's enormous oil wealth, which is what has kept Libya going. And I have always insisted that oil has been the heart, lungs, and and the arteries of Libya, and the one thing that actually ironically holds it together, because of course the oil sits in deep pockets in the south, in the Fezzan area. It comes up through tribal areas and it's distributed through the city-states in the north, on the coastal rim. So that is an area that they have to focus on. The most recent negotiations, which I would have to say our former colleague Stephanie Williams, I think, has done an incredible job with great diligence and with great wisdom and knowledge of the situation, and also with great fortitude, has been to continue to try to bring together these groups, which have over the years and since I served there, kind of kept fragmenting and breaking off and growing larger, because if there was one thing that Gaddafi did instill in Libyan minds, it was that they each had to say that they were all part of this great Jamahiriya, that they all had a voice for everything. And it creates a certain, one could say it was very democratic, others could say it's quite chaotic, but in any event, everyone wants to be a part of the discussions. And I think that they have gotten to a point after the disruption of the discussions in 2019 with the assault on Tripoli by Haftar. They have actually kind of rebuilt to a point where they're now looking at constitutional processes, and with a guarantee of elections in December 2021. They're having, they've had great meetings in Tunisia. There are still problems of bringing in the political elites. There are problems of deciding who will be the council of three, how it will be elected, how it will be chosen, who qualifies, and also then the election of a separate prime minister. And as usual, everyone's jockeying for power, whether overtly or subversively, I would say in some cases. And the big problem remains too that they don't have a constitutional basis yet that is going to determine what the limitations of authorities are, how those authorities will be selected, and what their actual governance will be, what their authorities will be. So that's one huge issue that's out there. They did do, and I know we have a lot of oil people on the line here, and I know they're watching very carefully what's going to happen to the oil agreement that the U.S. helped broker to keep the oil flowing. I think that many people were surprised to see how quickly Libyan oil production shot back up to 1.3 million barrels a day. But even that arrangement is it's right now it's vulnerable to the fact that there's no real authority for it. There's no constitutional authority for it. It's designed to end at the end of December. And then we're back in the same mess where you have the East arguing about where that oil and those revenues are going. You have the problems with the central bank and the Libyan overseas bank, because traditionally, as everyone who's dealt with Libya knows, the oil went into the overseas Libyan bank. It all came to the central bank. And the central bank, and this is something that has perplexed secretaries of state and others working on Libya alike, the central bank has been very assiduous about paying militias across the board, paying all Libyans, keeping their allowances going. Now, why would the bank do that? And this was something that, some people would say, why don't they just stop the payments to the militias? Well, it's because there are militias, armed militias. And this is another big issue in Libya, that there are very powerful armed militias who serve basically as mafia in some places, in other places who work for the government nominally. The reality is, at this moment, as Stephanie Williams has pointed out, there are 10 different military locations in Libya with non-Libyan military presence there, whether it's Turkish or Russian or Italian or a mix of other things, French, whatever it is. So now let me shift from that position. And by the way, I want to underscore here that I have always thought that if you left the Libyans to negotiate by themselves, they would come up with a Libyan solution that would work for them if it were sustained and supported by the international community. And this is if I had to fault all of us, it's that we have tiptoed around all these things because everyone has different interests. So now let's move to the drawing of Libya now and all the lines of countries that are involved in it. And it gets pretty complicated, but in its own way, again, as I say, it's a kind of a microcosm of what's happening internationally and what's happening in the region itself. I mean, who would ever have imagined that the US would be sanctioning its NATO ally, Turkey, with the second largest military in NATO, over the purchase by Turkey of a defense missile system from the former Soviet Union, from Russia. Meanwhile, Turkey is competing with Russia in other areas against each other. So who would have imagined that Dubai 2020 would include Israeli participation and not Turkish participation as one of the largest Sunni Muslim states in the world? And this is a brave new world. Who would have guessed that Italy and France would be at opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to Libya, two NATO allies, each having different interests? I think we could all imagine that Greece and Turkey would be snarking at each other in the Eastern Mediterranean about energy flows and newly discovered energy flows underneath, with Turkey saying, I think, and some have to, from their perspective, we have the most extensive coastline in the Eastern Mediterranean. Should we be limited to tourism? Is that what everybody's opinion is? And this is how the Turks see it. The same thing, the Turks on the S-400s, they say, well, you didn't sell us PAC-3s. What were we supposed to do? From the Turks' perspective, this is a political game, not a security game. From our perspective, it's Turkey gone rogue. From the Middle Eastern perspective, for a lot of people, this is neo-Ottomanism, which I keep hearing, and I keep smiling to myself because it shows an incredible lack of understanding, I think, of the Ottoman Empire itself and how it grew. But also at the same time from countries who in a way have adopted Ottoman patterns or Ottoman ways of allowing foreigners to live and work inside them without taking on national citizenship, which was again the Ottoman way. You provide stability, you have economic growth, and then you have all these other things. Well, I'm sure I'm raising a lot of antenna out in the area right now. But so what do we have in Libya right now? We have a situation where we also have another huge issue playing out, and that is the conflict in the region and within the Muslim world between two visions of Islam, and this will impact Biden's their decision making, and I think it will stymie and frustrate them because we have a very close partner in the UAE who very much believes in a kind of a secular nation state, seeing the UAE as a secular nation state of a Muslim character, the same way the United States is a secular nation state of a Christian, Judeo-Christian character, and now increasingly, of course, Muslim and everything else, because we're a hodgepodge, as opposed to worrying about Muslim states whose legitimacy is based on their Muslim character. And this has been why the urgent need to, I think, in some minds, to transform Saudi Arabia from being a state, because I think, as Rami Khouri brilliantly pointed out, the Arab Spring, which did trigger a lot of these things. I think you go back to two issues, 1979, and if you haven't read Kim Gaddis's book, read it. I wouldn't say everyone's going to agree with everything, but it lays out this first inclination of competing Islamic revolutions. And then you go to the Arab Spring. Rami Khouri laid out very clearly, I think there were two big issues about that. There was legitimacy and there was humiliation. When you had both things, you had uprisings. And so what you have is, one approach was just to say you allow certain freedoms within a structured authoritarian hereditary regime, and you construct your society in the direction you want it to go. And this works very well with small societies. And I think Barbara alluded to that. In the UAE, you can kind of guide your society when you have 1.2 million or 1.5 million or 2 million citizens. When you're a big place, or other places where there was humiliation and there was a lack of legitimacy, you had uprisings. And now that battle still goes on. Is Islam capable of conducting democratic elections? Are Muslim countries worthy or capable of having the kind of give and take in a democratic society and an exchange of power that you see in the West. And I would say that's an underlying argument. But especially it's not helped when you have a nominally democratic major Sunni country of 80 million plus citizens, which has gone increasingly autocratic and being seen in some people's minds that it's a steal of democracy. And it's exactly the pattern that we were warned about in the past when people said, do not trust political Islam. It's one man, one vote, one time, and it will increasingly end up in an autocratic regime that controls and jails journalists and everything else. And I think people have seen that. So we have these two competing ideas. And meanwhile, you have the Libyans saying, well, but we want self-determination. Well, you have the UAE saying we don't want political Islamists having access to that oil wealth. We have Russia saying, well, here's an opportunity to step in. We're in the soft underbelly of NATO and of Europe, and they're going to have a presence there. You know, they see the United States, space abhors a vacuum. When the United States moves out, others move in. You have Turkey going in there and saying, well, just like the Saudis with the Houthis, you know, we were invited by the UN recognized legitimate government in Tripoli to come in and support them against these usurpers in the East. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, that is true in a sense, but then do they stay? Do they stay or do they go? You have Qatar on one side, you have Italy, for which Libya is the sine qua non. It is an existential relationship with Italy. Existential. The gas that comes from Libya fuels Italy. And then you have the French getting involved because of counterterrorism issues in the South. So you have, and they are allying with the side that has labeled the other side Islamic terrorists, which I think both of these labels are all wrong. It's about power, it's about money, it's about access to that, all those things. Let me say this though, I think to wrap it up, where I think the Biden administration is going to find itself, not much different where we are now, unless they see a core, sincere Libyan effort to build a government that is transparent and reliable from within. If not, it's going to be focused still on energy production and counterterrorism measures, and it will be very ad hoc. Okay, thank you.